Chapter 1. The Invitation. Dr. Evelyn Hayes had spent her entire career studying the cosmos, fascinated by the dark corners of space where light couldn't escape. Yet, nothing had ever captivated her more than black holes. The idea that such an object could warp the very fabric of space and time, swallowing anything unfortunate enough to cross its path, felt like both a terrifying and thrilling enigma. When she received the letter, she thought it was a joke at first. It arrived in a simple envelope, but the seal was unlike anything she had seen before, a symbol that seemed to swirl, as if it had a life of its own. It was from a government agency she didn't recognize, offering her the chance to join a top-secret mission, to study a newly discovered black hole, the first of its kind to be accessed by humans. They had developed an experimental spacecraft capable of surviving the immense gravitational forces of the black hole's event horizon, and they wanted her expertise. The letter promised a journey beyond human comprehension, an opportunity to unravel the mysteries of the universe. The thought of being the first human to cross the event horizon, to see the darkness up close, consumed her. Despite the risk, Evelyn accepted without hesitation. Her life's work had led her to this moment. She would not turn away. As she boarded the ship, the event horizon, Evelyn couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. The crew was a mix of scientists, engineers, and astronauts, each one eager to be a part of history. She was the only astrophysicist, but she would be the one to study the black hole's intense gravitational waves, its event horizon, and the space-time distortions it created. Ready for the ride of a lifetime? Captain Ford asked, flashing a grin as they prepared for takeoff. Evelyn nodded, but there was no excitement in her heart, just an overwhelming sense that something was about to change, something she might not be able to control. Chapter 2. The Endless Abyss. The first few hours of the journey were uneventful. As the ship drifted further into space, Evelyn studied the black hole from the ship's observation deck. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. The supermassive black hole loomed on the horizon, its swirling accretion disk spinning with terrifying speed. It seemed to consume everything in its path, pulling in nearby stars, dust, and light. It was, in every sense, a void, a place where the laws of nature ceased to make sense. All systems are functioning within normal parameters, Lieutenant Rogers reported as they approached the black hole's outer edge. Evelyn's heart raced. As they neared the event horizon, the ship's instruments began to detect subtle distortions in space-time. The closer they got, the more the space around them warped. Light from distant stars bent and stretched like rubber bands. The entire cosmos twisted in impossible ways. Time slowing down. Evelyn whispered to herself, mesmerized by the spectacle. She tried to focus on her instruments, but the readings were increasingly erratic. The ship's path seemed to curve, though they hadn't changed direction. Are we in the event horizon yet? Dr. Patel, a physicist on board, asked. No, Evelyn answered. Not yet, but we're close. We've entered the black hole's influence. A sense of weightlessness began to settle over the crew. Time, too, seemed to stretch. The hours on the clock no longer made sense. As they passed into the outermost edge of the event horizon, the black hole's pull intensified, and for a brief moment, the stars seemed to flicker, like a distant memory struggling to hold on. We're crossing the event horizon, Evelyn said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. And then, without warning, they lost contact with Earth. The signal vanished, swallowed by the infinite void. The crew's communication systems were no longer functioning. We're cut off, Captain Ford said, his face pale. We can't go back. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer a scientific mission. It was a desperate voyage into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Event Horizon. Time continued to stretch, and with it, the crew's sense of reality began to unravel. The ship's systems were starting to experience malfunctions. The engines hummed with an unnatural resonance, and the walls of the ship seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. Is anyone else feeling this? Dr. Patel asked, his voice trembling. Like The ship is moving, even though we're not doing anything. Evelyn nodded slowly, trying to make sense of the phenomenon. The black hole is distorting the fabric of space and time. We're in its grip now. Nothing here is going to behave like it does outside. Despite the growing anxiety among the crew, Evelyn remained calm, at least outwardly. The black hole was an enigma, a place where time no longer made sense. It should have been thrilling, the culmination of her life's work. Yet, the more they approached its center, the more she felt a deep unease that she couldn't explain. Soon, strange things began happening. They all saw it at once. Ghostly images flickering on the ship's monitors. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was something else. Faces, shadows, figures in the distance. And they were all familiar. Family members, old friends, past lovers. People who shouldn't have been there. Captain, Lieutenant Rogers said, his voice shaking. We're seeing things. I swear I just saw my mother. She's been dead for years. Others began to experience similar hallucinations. Evelyn, too, heard whispers at the edges of her consciousness. She tried to focus on the instruments, but the numbers were warping, the readings nonsensical. There's something wrong, she said, a chill crawling up her spine. Dr. Patel looked at her with wide eyes. Is it the black hole? Is it affecting our minds? I don't know, Evelyn admitted. But we're not just dealing with space anymore. We're in a place where time, reality, and consciousness don't follow the same rules. We're losing ourselves in it. The crew tried to stay focused, but the terrifying reality was sinking in. They were no longer mere observers. They were participants in the black hole's strange, nightmarish realm. Chapter 4, Hallucinations. The hallucinations grew worse with each passing hour. At first, they were small, a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision, a distorted image on the monitors. But soon, they were impossible to ignore. Evelyn sat alone in the ship's control room late one night, staring at the ship's map, trying to calculate their position. The stars outside the observation window seemed to twist, their shapes bending and warping as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. It was like looking into a vast kaleidoscope, a fractured version of reality that made her head spin. Then, as she turned to check on the instruments, she saw it. Her father, standing in the doorway. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled faintly, but it wasn't the face of the man she remembered. It was as if it were wrong. His eyes were empty, hollow, like two black pits staring into her soul. He didn't speak, but his mouth moved. The words were unintelligible. The air grew thick, suffocating. Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest as her father's form grew more distorted. "Leave me alone," she whispered, trying to break free of the vision. But the figure didn't vanish. It stayed, frozen, an unsettling presence. Her mind screamed at her that this wasn't real, that she wasn't seeing her father. But the longer she looked at him, the more it felt like he was truly there. Suddenly, she heard a voice, distorted and low. "You shouldn't have come." The figure disappeared just as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving Evelyn shaken. She stumbled back, gasping for air. Was it a hallucination? Or was something more sinister happening? "Dr. Hayes?" Lieutenant Rogers' voice echoed through the intercom. "You okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," Evelyn lied, wiping the sweat from her brow. Just a little tired, but she wasn't fine. And she had a feeling that the horrors she was experiencing were only just beginning. Chapter 5, The Lost Crew. Days began to slip away with no clear sense of time. The crew's sleep cycles grew more erratic. Some could sleep, but when they woke, they found themselves in different parts of the ship. Others couldn't remember when they'd last rested, as if the black hole itself had dragged their minds into some twisted, fractured version of time. Evelyn noticed at first. Something was wrong with the ship. The corridors no longer felt familiar. The metal walls twisted and bent, as though the ship were breathing. The starboard corridor, where the crew usually gathered for meals, now stretched farther than it had before. There were new hallways, doors that had never existed. "Captain, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaky. Ford, pale and sweating, sat at the ship's central command. "What's going on, Hayes? I can feel it too. This place. It's different." Evelyn struggled to explain the dread she felt. The ship seemed to be alive, its passages pulling them in different directions, or at least that's how it felt. Something had begun to change. The crew, once united in their mission, was starting to fracture. "I saw Patel earlier," Lieutenant Rogers said from across the room. "He was standing in the corridor, but it wasn't him. It was something else wearing his face." Everyone fell silent. "Are we going insane?" Dr. Shapiro, the ship's medical officer, asked in a near whisper. "We've been exposed to some kind of space-time distortion. We don't know how it's affecting us." Evelyn wanted to say something to reassure them, but she couldn't. She had seen things, too. Not just the hallucinations, but a deep, unexplainable fear that crawled into the back of her mind. It was like something was reaching out to them, something that had always been there. When they tried to track their position, the maps and coordinates were meaningless. The black holes pull had distorted their sense of direction. They weren't just lost in space. They were lost in time, and no amount of science could explain what was happening. One by one, the crew members started to disappear. It began with Lieutenant Rogers. He'd gone to sleep, only to vanish the next morning, his bed untouched but with no trace of him anywhere. Panic set in. "There's no sign of him," Captain Ford said, his voice laced with fear. "He's just gone." They searched the entire ship, but there was nothing. No trace. No sign. As though he never existed. And yet they all felt it, the eerie absence. Dr. Patel, who had been holding together what little remained of the crew's sanity, became the next to disappear. His belongings were left in place, but his room was empty. The ship's cameras revealed nothing. The corridors seemed to have swallowed him whole. Evelyn, horrified, finally understood. The black hole wasn't just pulling them into its depths, it was erasing them piece by piece from existence. And they were helpless to stop it. Chapter 6. The Infinite Corridor. It wasn't just the crew that was disappearing. The ship itself was changing. Evelyn wandered through the now almost unrecognizable halls, following a faint, insistent pull that she couldn't explain. The metal walls seemed to pulse and breathe as though alive, shifting and stretching. The architecture had become impossible to navigate. She'd found a new corridor, one that wasn't on any of the maps. The walls were lined with symbols, jagged and incomprehensible, symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Evelyn reached out to touch one of the walls. As her fingers brushed against the cold metal, the symbols rippled outward, warping the very space around her. Something is here. It was the only thought she could form. The ship wasn't merely a vessel. It was a prison, a containment field for something ancient, something the black hole had trapped long ago. And now, that something was awakening. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She turned quickly, expecting to see one of the remaining crew. But there was no one there. The air grew thick, heavy. A hum vibrated through the walls, low and deep, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. The corridor stretched on impossibly long, as if it would never end. At the far end of the corridor, a faint light flickered, pulling her forward. Despite the dread gnawing at her, Evelyn was compelled to move toward it, drawn by an unknown force. When she finally reached the light, she saw what had been calling her, a massive, ancient stone archway. It was carved with more symbols, symbols she recognized from ancient manuscripts and myths. The arch was not part of the ship. It was something else, something older. It was a gateway. The closer Evelyn approached, the more it felt like the very air around her was alive, pulsing with energy. The doorway beckoned. She stepped closer, almost as if in a trance. Chapter 7. The Voices. The moment Evelyn stepped through the archway, the ship seemed to shift again. This time, she could feel it. Something else was inside, something ancient and vast, and it was calling her. The voices started as whispers, faint and distant. They grew louder the further she walked, each one more distinct. The voices weren't just of the crew. They were old, ancient voices, echoing in languages she didn't understand, words that shouldn't exist in any human tongue. She heard her name, her real name, spoken softly, lovingly. Evelyn. The voice lingered, almost seductive, but there was something wrong with it. The voice didn't belong to anyone she knew. It felt foreign, primal. And then she heard others, screams, pleas for help, the voices of those who had vanished, but they were distorted, twisted into something monstrous. Help me, please. She turned in circles, trying to pinpoint where the voices were coming from, but every direction felt wrong. The walls, the floor, the very space around her seemed to bend in on itself. She could feel herself growing disoriented, trapped in a maze with no exit. And then there it was, the voice again, louder now, closer. You cannot leave, it whispered. You have awakened me. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. The black hole wasn't just a gravitational anomaly. It was a prison that had contained an entity for eons. And by crossing its threshold, they had broken the seal. The sleeper had been released. Chapter 8. The Prison of Time. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her mind reeling. She could feel the weight of the sleeper's presence bearing down on her, pressing into her skull. The very fabric of space seemed to stretch and tear. Time itself was unraveling, breaking into pieces. She was no longer certain if she was still on the ship. The walls had melted away, leaving only a vast, infinite expanse. The ship's corridors were gone. There was no ship, only a cosmic void, and in the distance, something moved. It was the sleeper, a colossal, riding mass of shadows and starlight, its form shifting and ever-changing. Its voice echoed through the space, louder now, its power unmistakable. You cannot escape, it rumbled, the sound reverberating in her mind. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as her body trembled. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the darkness. And then she realized the sleeper wasn't just a being. It was the very essence of the black hole, a cosmic entity trapped in its depths for millennia, now freed by their arrival. And now it was awake, and it would never let them leave. Chapter 9. The Time Paradox. The ship's timeline was collapsing. Days turned into weeks, then into years, and back into seconds. Evelyn found herself in and out of alternate realities. Some where she was with the crew, some where they were gone, some where she was all alone. She saw flashes of the future, of a universe where stars died and galaxies were devoured by darkness. Time was a loop, twisting back on itself, a never-ending cycle of destruction and rebirth. The sleeper was feeding off time, bending it to its will. In this fractured existence, Evelyn was both a witness and a prisoner. The longer she stayed, the more she felt herself fading, slipping between the cracks in reality. Chapter 10. The Entity Awakens. In the final moments, Evelyn understood the true purpose of the black hole. It wasn't just a cosmic phenomenon. It was a prison, a tomb for the sleeper, an entity that had been dormant for untold eons. And now it was awake, and it would never let them leave. Chapter 10. The Entity Awakens. Evelyn's mind was unraveling. Her thoughts were no longer her own, slipping between fractured timelines, confused visions, and distorted memories. The black hole had not only torn apart their ship, it had twisted the very essence of time itself. And somewhere in the folds of this broken universe, the sleeper waited. The entity, whose presence loomed over them like an ancient, suffocating shadow, was now fully awake. It wasn't just a mindless being. It was something more insidious, something that existed beyond the rules of space and time, a creature whose hunger was not for matter, but for the very fabric of existence. As Evelyn wandered through the hallways that had long since lost all meaning, She could hear whispers, no screams, echoing through the distorted space. The voices of the crew, but distorted, twisted. Some were pleading for mercy. Others begged for release. Some simply cried out in horror, knowing they had crossed a point of no return. It was then that Evelyn saw him, Captain Ford, or what was left of him. His body was slumped in a corner of the corridor, his eyes wide, vacant, and filled with terror. He had not just disappeared. He had been consumed by the black hole's power, twisted into something unrecognizable. His body was bloated, his face stretched and distorted, as though he had been pulled through some unimaginable torment. Ford, Evelyn's voice cracked as she knelt beside him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His lips moved, forming words, but they were incomprehensible. "You can't save him," a voice rumbled from deep within the ship. Evelyn's skin prickled as she turned toward the source. The wall seemed to pulse, undulating like a living organism. The sleeper was speaking through the ship. It was the ship now, its very essence intertwined with the black hole's presence. It was inescapable. "Help me!" Ford screamed, but his voice was not his own. It was the voice of the black hole, amplified through his mouth. "Help me before it's too late." But Evelyn could do nothing. She had known from the moment she crossed the event horizon that she was already lost. There was no going back. There was only the blackness, the entity, and the endless loop of suffering. Chapter 11. A Fractured Reality. The ship, if it could still be called that, had become a grotesque labyrinth of shifting corridors and flickering lights. What had once been a sleek, technologically advanced vessel was now a twisted reflection of its former self, morphing in ways Evelyn could not comprehend. One moment, she was in the command center. The next, she was walking through a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with broken doors, walls that dripped with liquid shadows, and floors that buckled beneath her feet. Time was irrelevant. Space had no meaning. Evelyn realized she wasn't alone. She saw him again, Dr. Patel. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembling as he reached out to her. He had been dead, hadn't he? She had seen him disappear, swallowed by the black hole's grip. But here he was, standing before her as if nothing had happened. "Evelyn," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his. "I've seen it. I've seen the end of everything." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked, struggling to make sense of it all. "What happened to you?" Dr. Patel stepped closer, his features flickering like a broken television screen. "The sleeper? It shows you the truth, Evelyn. The truth about the universe. About us. We're nothing more than fleeting moments in its eternal hunger. It will devour everything. It will erase all of us." Evelyn backed away, fear rising in her chest. "You're not real. None of this is real." "Then why are you here, Evelyn? Why do you keep coming back?" The walls around her began to warp and twist, the ship's interior shifting in a way that made her feel dizzy, as if her very thoughts were being pulled in multiple directions at once. She tried to focus, to center herself, but the more she concentrated, the more the world around her bent, like light refracting through water. "Help me," Dr. Patel whispered one last time before disappearing into the void. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, unable to understand what was real anymore. The black hole had twisted their fates, and now, it seemed, their very existence was tied to its insatiable hunger. Chapter 12. The Abyss Inside. Days, or was it weeks, had passed. Evelyn couldn't tell anymore. She had lost track of time. Her mind was fractured, splintering into pieces as she wandered the endless halls of the ship, now barely a ship at all. The walls no longer felt like metal. They felt like flesh, pulsing, breathing with a rhythm of their own. Every now and then, she would hear the crew's voices, faint echoes from some distant corner of her mind. They were crying out, their souls trapped in the black hole's grasp. But it was not just their voices she heard. In the distance, she heard something else, something louder, something more terrible. It was the sound of the sleeper, the entity that had been unleashed by their arrival. It was coming closer, and it was hungry. Evelyn stumbled into the central hub of the ship. The console flickered to life, and she saw the monitor screen flash with incomprehensible symbols. For a moment, she thought she saw a face, a grotesque, shifting visage of terror. Then it was gone. The ship's control systems were beyond repair, but Evelyn's instincts kicked in. She knew there was no escaping the black hole. There was no escape from the sleeper. The only way to stop it, if it could be stopped, was to somehow destroy the ship, severing the connection between the entity and the black hole. But she knew that even if she did, the darkness would follow. It always did. A sudden thought gripped her, a terrifying realization. She was no longer sure if she was alive. Was this just a dream, a nightmare within the black hole's grasp, or had she already crossed into some other realm? She could hear it now, the sleeper's voice. "You are mine, Evelyn. We all are. You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to join me." Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to brace herself against the overwhelming force of the entity's presence. She had no choice now. She would either be consumed or she would embrace the abyss. Chapter 13, A World Consumed. The air around her began to distort. Her skin felt like it was being torn apart by invisible forces. The ship that had once been their salvation, was nothing more than a vessel for the sleeper, a tool for the entity's insatiable appetite. Evelyn could feel the space around her bending, collapsing in on itself. She was no longer just on the ship. She was in the black hole itself, in the heart of the void where the laws of nature had no meaning. The universe was unraveling, and there was no escape. As the gravity of the black hole intensified, the walls began to break apart, crumbling into the infinite abyss. The stars outside, the few that remained, stretched and twisted like rivers of light being pulled into the maw of the black hole. And then, with a sudden jolt, Evelyn was there. She was inside it. She had crossed the event horizon, and the universe as she knew it ceased to exist. There was no up or down, no forward or backward. There was only the endless, consuming darkness. The sleeper was all around her. In the void, it whispered, its presence suffocating. "You will become one with me, Evelyn. You are no longer just human. You are part of something eternal." Evelyn closed her eyes, her body trembling as she let go of herself. In the end, there was no choice. She had crossed the point of no return. The black hole had taken everything, her crew, her ship, her very existence. All that was left was the void and the endless hunger of the sleeper. And as the darkness consumed her, she knew she was no longer alone. She was part of something far older, far darker than she had ever imagined. Chapter 14, The Endless Cycle. Time, as it had once existed, was gone. Evelyn had become part of the black hole's infinite hunger, a cog in a machine that stretched across the universe. The sleeper, her soul now one with the entity, began to drift through the cosmos, devouring worlds and stars in its wake. And so, the cycle continued, an endless dance of destruction and rebirth, a never-ending cycle of existence and oblivion. Time, space, and reality twisted into a perfect paradox. Evelyn's voice echoed in the void, a whispered warning for any who might come after her. Do not enter the black hole. You are not meant to know what lies beyond, but the black hole would always be there, waiting, and the cycle would begin again,